The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the Fort Worth stockyards as thousands of visitors poured through the gates of the annual Cowboy convention. It was July 12, 2003, and the air was thick with the smell of barbecue, leather, and excitement. Among the sea of cowboy hats and boots walked a man who had no idea he was living his final hours of freedom. Marcus "Mac" Henderson adjusted his authentic Stetson hat as he navigated through the crowded convention grounds. At 42 years, old Mac was the embodiment of the modern cowboy, a successful ranch owner from Amarillo who had built his reputation on breeding championship quarter horses. His weathered hands told stories of decades working with cattle, and his easy smile had charmed everyone from fellow ranchers to city folk who dreamed of the cowboy lifestyle. "Mac, over here," called out his longtime friend Tommy Rodriguez, waving from near the bull riding arena. Tommy had driven down from Oklahoma specifically to meet Mac at the convention, something they had done together for the past 8 years without fail. Mac pushed through the crowd, his silver belt buckle catching the afternoon light. He had won that buckle at a rodeo in Lubbock 15 years earlier, and it had become his signature piece. Everyone who knew Mac could spot him in a crowd just by looking for that gleaming buckle. "Thought you might have gotten lost in all this chaos." Tommy laughed, slapping Mac on the back. "You see the size of this crowd? Must be twice as big as last year." Mac nodded, but Tommy noticed something different about his friend's demeanor. Usually, Mac was the life of any gathering, telling stories and making everyone around him laugh. Today he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and scanning the crowd as if looking for someone. "Everything all right, partner?" Tommy asked, genuine concern creeping into his voice. "Yeah, just expecting to meet someone here today," Mac replied, his eyes still searching the faces around them. Business opportunity. Could change everything. For the ranch. This was the first Tommy had heard of any business meeting. In all their years of friendship, Mac had always been transparent about his dealings. The ranch was doing well. Mac had mentioned just last month that he was considering expanding his operation. What kind of opportunity would require a secretive meeting at a Cowboy convention? The afternoon wore on, and the two friends made their rounds through the various exhibits. They watched demonstrations of rope tricks, admired prize-winning horses, and sampled some of the best barbecue Texas had to offer. But Mac's distraction only seemed to grow worse as the hours passed. At 4:30 p.m., Mac's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Tommy saw his friend's face change completely. The color drained from Mac's cheeks, and his jaw tightened. "I've got to go," Mac said abruptly, pocketing his phone. "Go where?" "The evening events are just getting started," Tommy protested. "We haven't even seen the championship bronc riding yet." "Something's come up. I'll catch up with you later tonight at the hotel," Mac said, already backing away from his friend. "Save me a beer." Those were the last words Tommy Rodriguez would ever hear from his best friend. Mac disappeared into the crowd, his distinctive hat bobbing through the sea of people before vanishing completely. Tommy assumed Mac would return within an hour or two, probably with some wild story about the mysterious business meeting. He continued enjoying the convention, occasionally glancing toward the entrance, expecting to see Mac's familiar figure walking back through the gates. But Mac never returned. When Tommy woke up the next morning in their shared hotel room, Mac's bed was still perfectly made. His truck was still in the parking lot, keys sitting on the nightstand where he always left them. His wallet, containing over $300 in cash, was in his jacket pocket. Everything Mac owned was exactly where he had left it, except Mac himself. Tommy's initial annoyance quickly turned to worry, then to panic. He called Mac's cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. He contacted the hotel staff, the convention organizers, even the local police. No one had seen Marcus Henderson since he walked away from the bull riding arena at 4:30 p.m. on July 12, 2003. The Fort Worth Police Department launched an immediate investigation. They interviewed hundreds of convention attendees, reviewed security, footage from nearby businesses, and conducted extensive searches of the surrounding area. Mac's face appeared on local news broadcasts, and missing person flyers were distributed throughout Texas and neighboring states. Detective Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on the case, found the circumstances particularly puzzling. "In my 15 years on the force, I've never seen a disappearance quite like this," she told reporters. Mr. Henderson had no known enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. He simply vanished without a trace. The investigation revealed that Mac had indeed received a phone call at 4:30 p.m., but the number was traced to a prepaid cell phone that had been purchased with cash and never used again. The caller's identity remained a complete mystery. Mac's family was devastated. His younger sister Rebecca flew in from California to help with the search efforts. His elderly parents, who had always been so proud of their successful son, aged years in a matter of days. The ranch that Mac had worked so hard to build began to suffer without his leadership. Mac would never just leave, Rebecca insisted during a tearful press conference. He loved that ranch more than anything. He was planning to expand it, to maybe start a family of his own. He had everything to live for. As weeks turned into months, the trail grew colder. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigation, but even their resources and expertise couldn't crack the case. Mac's disappearance became one of those mysteries that haunted everyone involved, the kind of case that detectives carry with them long after they retire. The annual Cowboy convention continued in subsequent years, but it was never quite the same. Vendors and regular attendees would often ask about Mac, sharing memories of his infectious laugh and generous spirit. A memorial plaque was eventually installed near the bull riding arena, marking the spot where he was last seen. Tommy Rodriguez never returned to the convention. The joy had been sucked out of it for him. Instead, he spent every July 12th visiting Mac's parents, keeping his friend's memory alive through stories and shared grief. But what none of them knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that the answer to Mac's disappearance lay not in Fort Worth, not in Texas, but 300 miles south in San Antonio, buried in the shadow of one of America's most famous historical landmarks. The truth would remain hidden for 15 long years, waiting for a retired teacher with a metal detector and an afternoon to kill. The Henderson family ranch in Amarillo felt like a ghost town in the weeks following Mac's disappearance. The 2,000-acre spread that had once buzzed with activity now stood eerily quiet, save for the occasional whinnying of horses that seemed to be calling for their missing owner. Rebecca Henderson Walsh had taken an indefinite leave of absence from her job as a marketing executive in Los Angeles to manage the ranch and coordinate the search efforts. Every morning she would wake up in Mac's bedroom, hoping against hope that she would hear his boots on the wooden floors downstairs, that this nightmare would finally be over. "The horses know something's wrong," said Miguel Santos, the ranch foreman who had worked for Mac for over a decade. Miguel was a weathered man in his 50s, whose loyalty to the Henderson family ran deeper than blood. Especially Thunder. That stallion hasn't been the same since Mac disappeared. Thunder was Mac's prized quarter horse, a magnificent black stallion worth over $50,000. The horse had been Mac's constant companion, and their bond was legendary among the local ranching community. Now Thunder barely ate, spending most of his time staring toward the main road as if waiting for Mac's truck to come rumbling up the gravel driveway. Detective Sarah Chen made the 3-hour drive from Fort Worth to Amarillo multiple times during those first crucial weeks. She interviewed every ranch hand, every neighbor, every business associate Mac had dealt with in the months leading up to his disappearance. What she found painted the picture of a man who had everything going for him. Mac was planning to propose to Linda Morrison, revealed his neighbor Bill Garrett during one of Chen's interviews. Linda was a veterinarian from Canyon who had been dating Mac for 8 months. He'd been talking about it for weeks, even showed me the ring he'd bought. Said he was going to pop the question after the convention. The engagement ring, a stunning 2-carat diamond, was found in Mac's bedroom safe, along with $20,000 in cash and important documents. If Mac had planned to disappear voluntarily, why would he leave behind such valuable items? Linda Morrison was devastated by the news. Mac never mentioned any business meeting, she sobbed during her interview with Detective Chen. He was so excited about the convention, he'd been looking forward to it for months. We were supposed to have dinner when he got back, and he was going to tell me about some big surprise he had planned. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Chen discovered that Mac had made several unusual phone calls in the weeks before his disappearance. Phone records showed that he had contacted a private investigator in Dallas, a genealogy research company, and most mysteriously the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the organization that managed the Alamo. Why would a cattle rancher from Amarillo be calling about the Alamo? Chen wondered aloud to her partner, Detective Mike Torres. What possible connection could there be? The private investigator, James Whitfield, was reluctant to discuss his conversations with Mac, citing client confidentiality. But under pressure from law enforcement, he eventually revealed that Mac had hired him to research his family history. Mac believed he might be descended from one of the defenders of the Alamo, Whitfield explained. He'd found some old family documents in his grandfather's belongings after the old man passed away last year. There were letters, a diary, some artifacts that suggested his great-great-grandfather might have been at the Alamo in 1836. This revelation added a new dimension to the mystery. Mac's grandfather, Samuel Henderson, had died in February 2003, just 5 months before Mac's disappearance. The old man had been a bit of a recluse in his final years, living alone in a small house on the outskirts of Amarillo. When Mac cleaned out the house after the funeral, he had discovered a trunk full of old documents and artifacts that Samuel had never mentioned to anyone. Rebecca remembered Mac's excitement about the discovery. He was like a kid on Christmas morning, she recalled. He kept talking about how our family might have this incredible connection to Texas history. He said he was going to prove that our ancestor was a hero at the Alamo. The genealogy research company confirmed that Mac had been working with them to trace his lineage back to the 1830s. According to their records, Mac believed his great-great-grandfather, Josiah Henderson, had been one of the 189 defenders who died at the Alamo on March 6, 1836. Mr. Henderson was very passionate about this research, said Dr. Patricia Valdez, the genealogist who had been working with Mac. He brought in some fascinating artifacts, an old pistol, a leather journal, a silver locket. He was convinced these items had belonged to Josiah Henderson and had somehow survived the battle. But here's where the story took a darker turn. Dr. Valdez revealed that Mac's research had uncovered something unexpected, something that had clearly disturbed him. In our last conversation, about 2 weeks before he disappeared, Mac seemed troubled, Dr. Valdez continued. He said he'd found evidence that Josiah Henderson might not have died at the Alamo after all. He thought his ancestor might have survived the battle and lived under a different identity for years afterward. This discovery had apparently consumed Mac in the weeks leading up to the convention. According to Linda Morrison, he had become obsessed with proving his theory, spending hours poring over historical documents and making phone calls to historians and museums across Texas. He kept saying he was on the verge of a major discovery, Linda remembered. Something that would change everything we know about the Alamo. I thought he was getting a little carried away with it all, but Mac was so passionate about history. I didn't want to discourage him. The mysterious phone call that had summoned Mac away from the convention was beginning to make more sense. Detective Chen theorized that someone had contacted Mac with information about his ancestor. Information important enough to make him abandon his best friend and rush off to a secret meeting. But who had made that call? And what had they told Mac that was so urgent it couldn't wait until after the convention? The investigation hit another roadblock when Chen tried to track down the artifacts Mac had shown to the genealogist. When she searched Mac's ranch house, the trunk containing his grandfather's belongings was nowhere to be found. Miguel Santos confirmed that Mac had moved the trunk to his bedroom just days before leaving for Fort Worth, but now it had vanished along with its owner. Someone took that trunk, Rebecca insisted. Mac would never have moved those artifacts without telling me. They meant everything to him. The disappearance of the historical artifacts added a new layer of complexity to the case. Had Mac taken them with him to the mysterious meeting? Had someone stolen them? Or were they hidden somewhere on the ranch waiting to be discovered? As the summer of 2003 dragged on, the media attention began to fade. Mac's story was replaced by other news, other tragedies, other mysteries, but Detective Chen refused to give up. She had a feeling that the key to solving Mac's disappearance lay somewhere in the tangled web of Texas history and family secrets. What she didn't know was that 300 miles away in San Antonio, those secrets were literally buried in the ground, waiting for the right person with the right equipment to uncover them. The truth about Marcus Henderson's fate was sleeping beneath the Texas soil, guarded by the ghosts of the Alamo and the weight of nearly 2 centuries of silence. The clock was ticking, but it would be 15 more years before time finally ran out on this mystery. The Fort Worth Police Department's cold case files grew thicker with each passing month, but Mac Henderson's disappearance remained one of Detective Sarah Chen's most haunting unsolved cases. Even after she was promoted to lieutenant in 2005, she would pull out Mac's file whenever she had a quiet moment, studying the evidence and wondering what she had missed. Some cases just get under your skin, Chen would tell her colleagues. Mac Henderson was one of those cases. By 2006, the official investigation had been scaled back significantly. The FBI had closed their file, concluding that Mac had likely been the victim of foul play. Though they couldn't determine the motive or identify any suspects, the case was officially classified as a homicide, despite the absence of a body. Mac's family struggled to move forward without closure. His parents, Robert and Martha Henderson, both in their 70s, had aged dramatically in the 3 years since their son's disappearance. Robert suffered a heart attack in 2004, which the family attributed to the stress of not knowing what had happened to Mac. Martha developed severe depression and rarely left the house. Not knowing is the worst part, Martha told a reporter on the 3rd anniversary of Mac's disappearance. If we knew he was dead, we could grieve and try to heal. But this limbo, it's killing us slowly. Rebecca had eventually returned to Los Angeles, but she made the trip back to Texas every few months to check on her parents and the ranch. Miguel Santos had done his best to keep the operation running, but without Mac's leadership and passion, the ranch was struggling financially. We had to sell off most of the prize horses, Miguel explained to a local newspaper in 2007. Mac's breeding program was his life's work, but we just couldn't maintain it without him. It breaks my heart to see what this place has become. Thunder, Mac's beloved stallion, had been sold to a ranch in Oklahoma. The decision had been agonizing for the family, but they couldn't afford to keep such an expensive animal when the ranch was barely breaking even. The day Thunder was loaded into the trailer, Miguel Santos wept openly. Meanwhile, the mystery of Mac's historical research continued to puzzle investigators. Detective Chen had spent countless hours trying to understand the connection between Mac's disappearance and his obsession with his ancestors' role at the Alamo. She had contacted historians at the University of Texas, the Texas State Historical Association, and even the Alamo itself, but none of them had any record of Mac Henderson or his research. It was as if his investigation into Josiah Henderson had hit a dead end just before his disappearance. The timing is too coincidental, Chen noted in her case files. Mac disappears just as he's supposedly on the verge of a major historical discovery. Someone didn't want him to find what he was looking for. The private investigator, James Whitfield, had continued his research into the Henderson family lineage even after Mac's disappearance, hoping to find clues that might help solve the case. What he discovered in 2008 would have shocked Mac to his core. I found definitive proof that Josiah Henderson was never at the Alamo, Whitfield revealed to Detective Chen during a follow-up interview. In fact, he wasn't even in Texas in 1836. He was living in Louisiana at the time, working as a blacksmith. The family stories about him being an Alamo defender were completely false. This revelation raised even more questions. If Mac's ancestor had never been at the Alamo, why had someone contacted Mac with information about his research? What had they told him that was important enough to lure him away from the convention? Chen began to suspect that Mac had been deliberately misled by someone who knew about his research. Perhaps the mysterious caller had claimed to have information about Josiah Henderson, using Mac's passion for history as bait to draw him into a trap. But who would go to such elaborate lengths to harm Mac Henderson? And why? The answer might have been found in Mac's business dealings, which investigators had initially dismissed as routine. Mac's ranch had been more successful than anyone realized, and he had been quietly accumulating significant wealth through his horse breeding program and some shrewd real estate investments. Mac was worth close to $2 million when he disappeared, revealed his accountant, David Kim, during a 2009 interview. He was very private about his finances, but he had been making some major investments in the months before his disappearance. One of those investments was particularly intriguing. Mac had purchased a 500-acre plot of land near San Antonio just 6 weeks before his disappearance. The land was supposedly for expanding his ranching operation, but it was located over 300 miles from his main ranch, an unusual choice for someone based in Amarillo. Mac never mentioned buying land near San Antonio, Rebecca said when Chen informed her of the purchase. That doesn't make any sense. Why would he want property so far from home? The San Antonio property was located just 15 miles northeast of the city, in an area that was rapidly being developed for suburban housing. Mac had paid cash for the land, $400,000, and had told his real estate agent that he planned to use it for a special project. Chen drove to San Antonio to examine the property in person. What she found was 500 acres of rolling hills covered in mesquite trees and scrub brush. There was no sign that Mac had ever visited the land, no indication of what his special project might have been. But the property's location was significant for one reason. It was less than 20 miles from the Alamo. Mac bought land near the place he was researching, Chen noted in her case files. This can't be a coincidence. She interviewed the real estate agent who had handled the sale, a woman named Patricia Gonzalez, who specialized in rural properties around San Antonio. Mr. Henderson was very specific about what he wanted, Gonzalez recalled. He said the land had to be in that exact area, within a certain distance of downtown San Antonio. He seemed to know exactly what he was looking for, like he had researched the area extensively. Gonzalez also remembered something odd about Mac's behavior during the transaction. He kept asking about the history of the land, whether there had ever been any archaeological surveys done, whether anyone had ever found anything unusual on the property. It seemed like he was looking for something specific. This new information painted a clearer picture of Mac's final months. He had been conducting historical research, had discovered something that excited him, and had purchased land near San Antonio for reasons connected to that research. Then just weeks later, he had received a mysterious phone call and vanished without a trace. Chen was convinced that the key to solving Mac's disappearance lay somewhere on that 500-acre plot of land near San Antonio. But despite multiple searches, with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, investigators found nothing. The case remained cold, filed away in a cabinet in Fort Worth, while Mac's family continued their agonizing wait for answers. His parents grew older and frailer. His sister tried to rebuild her life in California, and his beloved ranch slowly crumbled without his guiding hand. But 300 miles away in San Antonio, a retired middle school history teacher named Frank Morrison was about to take up a new hobby that would change everything. Frank had always been fascinated by Texas history, and in 2018, at the age of 65, he decided to try his hand at metal detecting. He had no idea that his new pastime would soon uncover secrets that had been buried for 15 years, secrets that would finally bring justice for Mac Henderson and closure for his grieving family. The truth was waiting in the Texas soil, and Frank Morrison was about to dig it up. Frank Morrison had always been the kind of man who found adventure in the ordinary. During his 37 years teaching 8th grade history at Roosevelt Middle School in San Antonio, he had inspired countless students with his passion for Texas heritage and his ability to make the past come alive in the classroom. Mr. Morrison could make the Battle of San Jacinto sound like the most exciting movie you'd ever seen, remembered former student Maria Vasquez, now a successful lawyer in Houston. He had this way of connecting historical events to our lives today that made everything feel relevant and important. When Frank retired in June 2018, his colleagues threw him a farewell party complete with a cake shaped like the Alamo and a gag gift, a cheap metal detector from a local hobby shop. The accompanying card read, "For all those buried treasures you're always talking about." Frank laughed at the gift, but something about it intrigued him. He had always been fascinated by the idea that history was literally beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered. How many artifacts from Texas's rich past were lying just inches below the surface, forgotten by time, but preserved by the earth? Why not? Frank told his wife, Carol, as he examined the metal detector that evening. I've got nothing but time. Now, and you're always complaining that I need a hobby that gets me out of the house? Carol Morrison rolled her eyes affectionately. After 42 years of marriage, she knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was getting excited about a new project. Just promise me you won't turn our backyard into a construction site, she said. Frank's first few outings with the metal detector were disappointing. He found plenty of bottle caps, aluminum cans, and the occasional lost coin, but nothing that could remotely be considered historically significant. He began to understand why serious metal detecting enthusiasts invested in expensive professional-grade equipment. This thing couldn't find a silver dollar if it was sitting on top of the ground, Frank complained to his neighbor, retired police sergeant Eddie Ramirez, after a particularly fruitless afternoon at a local park. Maybe you need to think like a historian, Eddie suggested. Where would people have been likely to drop valuable things? What locations have historical significance? That conversation changed everything for Frank. Instead of randomly wandering around parks and beaches, he began researching locations with historical importance. He studied old maps of San Antonio, read accounts of battles and settlements, and identified areas where significant events had taken place. His breakthrough came when he discovered that the city had recently opened several historical sites to amateur archaeologists and metal detecting enthusiasts, provided they obtained proper permits and agreed to report any significant finds to the Texas Historical Commission. One of these sites was a 50-acre plot of land just northeast of downtown San Antonio, near the area where some historians believed Mexican forces had camped before the siege of the Alamo in 1836. The land had been donated to the city by a developer who wanted to build a shopping center but had been blocked by historical preservation groups. This is perfect, Frank told Carol as he showed her the permit application. If there's anywhere in San Antonio where you might find artifacts from the Texas Revolution, this would be it. Frank's first visit to the site was on a crisp Saturday morning in October 2018. He had upgraded to a more sophisticated metal detector, a Garrett AT Pro that cost him nearly $300, but promised much better depth and discrimination capabilities. The land was beautiful in a rugged, untamed way. Rolling hills covered with mesquite trees and native grasses stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, Frank could make out the San Antonio skyline, including the distinctive dome of the Majestic Theater and the Tower of the Americas. If I were a Mexican soldier in 1836, this is exactly where I'd want to set up camp, Frank mused as he began his systematic search of the area. High ground, good visibility, close enough to the city but far enough away to avoid detection. The first few hours, Frank's new metal detector performed about as well as his old one. He found the usual assortment of modern trash, pull tabs from aluminum cans, fragments of barbed wire, a few corroded pennies from the 1970s and 1980s. But just after noon, as Frank was working his way along a small creek that ran through the property, his detector began emitting a different kind of signal. Instead of the sharp, quick beeps that indicated small pieces of metal, this was a long, sustained tone that suggested something larger and deeper. Frank's heart began to race. In all his research about metal detecting, he had learned that this type of signal often indicated something significant, either a large piece of modern junk or just possibly something genuinely historical. He carefully marked the spot with a small flag and began digging. The Texas soil was hard and rocky, and it took him nearly 20 minutes to excavate a hole about 2 feet deep. His detector continued to indicate that the target was still deeper. Come on, Frank, he muttered to himself as sweat dripped down his forehead. You're 65 years old. Maybe it's time to admit this is harder work than you thought. But something kept him digging. Call it intuition, call it stubbornness, or call it the same passion for discovery that had made him such an effective teacher. Frank Morrison was not about to give up when he was this close to finding something. At a depth of nearly 3 feet, his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't a rock. The metallic clang echoed across the quiet hillside. and Frank's pulse quickened. He carefully cleared away the dirt around the object, using his hands, to avoid damaging whatever he had found. What emerged from the earth would haunt Frank Morrison for the rest of his life. It was a belt buckle, not the kind of simple utilitarian buckle you might expect to find from the 1830s, but an ornate, silver-plated buckle that was clearly much more recent. Even covered in dirt and tarnish, Frank could make out intricate engravings and what appeared to be some kind of inscription. But it wasn't the buckle itself that made Frank's blood run cold. It was what was attached to it, fragments of leather that had once been a belt, and caught in those fragments, something that made Frank drop his shovel and stumble backward. Human remains. Frank Morrison, retired history teacher and amateur metal detecting enthusiast, had just discovered what appeared to be a human skeleton buried 3 feet underground on a piece of land that was supposed to contain artifacts from the Texas Revolution. With shaking hands, Frank pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. San Antonio Police? I think I just found a body. Detective Maria Gonzalez had seen her share of unusual crime scenes during her 12 years with the San Antonio Police Department, but nothing quite like this. The call had come in at 3:47 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in August 2018. A metal detector enthusiast had discovered human remains near the Alamo. By the time Detective Gonzalez arrived at the scene, the area had been cordoned off, with yellow tape, and Frank Morrison sat on a nearby bench still clutching his metal detector and looking like he'd seen a ghost. The discovery site was in a small landscaped area about 50 yards from the main Alamo building, hidden behind a cluster of old oak trees that provided shade for tourists. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Detective Gonzalez," she said, approaching the shaken man. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Frank's hands trembled as he recounted his discovery. "I was just sweeping the area, you know? Looking for old coins, maybe some Civil War artifacts. The detector started going crazy right over there." He pointed to a spot where crime scene technicians were now carefully excavating. "I thought I'd hit the jackpot, maybe found some Spanish silver or something from the 1800s. Instead, you found bones," Detective Gonzalez said gently. "Not just bones," Frank whispered. There was a belt buckle, silver, with some kind of rodeo design on it, and what looked like the remains of a cowboy hat. Who buries someone in full cowboy gear? Detective Gonzalez made careful notes as the crime scene team worked. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Reeves, was already on site, carefully documenting the remains in their original position before removal. "Preliminary assessment suggests these remains have been here for quite some time," Dr. Reeves called out. "Based on the decomposition and the condition of the clothing fragments, I'd estimate somewhere between 10 to 20 years. The detective's mind immediately went to cold cases. A body buried for that long suggested this wasn't a recent crime, but rather something that had been hidden for years, possibly decades. She made a mental note to review missing persons reports from the early 2000s. As the excavation continued, more items were recovered from the makeshift grave. Along with the distinctive silver belt buckle, investigators found the metal eyelets from cowboy boots, a corroded cell phone, and fragments of what appeared to be a leather wallet. Most intriguingly, they discovered a small plastic bag containing what looked like documents, somehow preserved despite years underground. "Detective, you need to see this," called out Officer James Park, one of the crime scene technicians. He was holding up the silver belt buckle, now cleaned of dirt and debris. "There's an inscription on the back." Detective Gonzalez pulled on latex gloves and examined the buckle carefully. Engraved in small, precise letters were the words, "Marcus Henderson, Lubbock Rodeo Champion 1988. The name meant nothing to her, but she knew it would to someone. She immediately called the department's database specialist to run a search on Marcus Henderson, particularly focusing on missing persons reports from Texas. While waiting for the database results, Detective Gonzalez interviewed Frank Morrison more thoroughly. The retired teacher had been metal detecting as a hobby for over 20 years and knew the Alamo grounds better than most tour guides. "This area where you found the remains," she asked, "is it a popular spot for metal detecting?" Frank shook his head. "Not really. Most detectorists stick to the more open areas, or they try to get permission to search the actual battlefield sites. This little grove is kinda tucked away. I only decided to check it because I'd covered everywhere else and had some time to kill. Have you ever found anything significant here before? Small stuff. A few old coins, some buttons that might have been from military uniforms. Nothing like this, though. Nothing that would suggest someone had been buried here. Detective Gonzalez's phone buzzed with a text from the database specialist. Found your Marcus Henderson, missing from Fort Worth, July 2003. Sending file now. As she read through Mac Henderson's missing persons file on her phone, the pieces began falling into place. The timeline matched perfectly. Mac had disappeared in July 2003, and Dr. Reeves estimated the remains had been buried for 15 to 20 years. The belt buckle was an exact match for the one described in the original missing persons report. But what was a cowboy from Amarillo doing buried in San Antonio, 300 miles from where he'd disappeared? Dr. Reeves, Detective Gonzalez called out. How long before we can get a positive identification on these remains? I'll need to run dental records and DNA analysis to be certain, but based on the personal effects and the physical characteristics I can observe, I'd say we're looking at a Caucasian male approximately 40-45 years old at time of death. The height and build seem consistent with the missing persons report you just showed me. Detective Gonzalez knew she needed to contact the Fort Worth Police Department immediately. If these were indeed Mac Henderson's remains, it would finally provide answers to a case that had haunted investigators for 15 years. But it would also raise a whole new set of questions. She stepped away from the crime scene and dialed the Fort Worth PD. After being transferred twice, she was connected to Detective Sarah Chen, who had been the lead investigator on Mac's disappearance. Detective Chen, this is Detective Gonzalez, with San Antonio PD. I believe we may have found your missing cowboy. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus Henderson, after all these years? We're still waiting on positive identification, but the evidence is pretty compelling. Silver rodeo belt buckle with his name engraved on it. Timeline matches, physical characteristics match. He was buried near the Alamo. The Alamo? Detective Chen's voice was filled with confusion. What the hell was Mac doing in San Antonio? There was never any indication he had business there, no connections to the city at all. That's what we need to figure out. I'm going to need everything you have on the original investigation. Witness statements, phone records, financial records, everything. I'll have it all sent over within the hour, Detective Chen promised. Detective Gonzalez, I need you to know. This case has haunted me for 15 years. Mac Henderson was a good man who just vanished into thin air. If someone killed him and dumped his body in San Antonio, I want to know who and why. As Detective Gonzalez hung up the phone, she watched the crime scene team carefully removing Mac's remains from their hidden grave. The silver belt buckle caught the late afternoon sunlight, just as it had that day at the Fort Worth stockyards when Mac had walked away from his best friend for the last time. But now, 15 years later, Mac Henderson was finally coming home. The news of the discovery spread quickly through law enforcement channels, but Detective Gonzalez made sure to contact Mac's family before any media outlets got wind of the story. Rebecca Henderson Walsh was still living in Amarillo, having never fully returned to her life in Los Angeles after her brother's disappearance. The phone call came at 6:30 p.m., just as Rebecca was finishing up the evening feeding at the ranch. She had kept the operation going all these years, partly out of hope that Mac would return and partly because she couldn't bear to let his life's work disappear along with him. Ms. Henderson Walsh, this is Detective Maria Gonzalez with the San Antonio Police Department. I'm calling about your brother Marcus. Rebecca's heart stopped. In 15 years, she had received dozens of calls from law enforcement agencies across the country. Possible sightings, unidentified remains, new leads that always led nowhere. She had learned to steel herself for disappointment. What have you found? She asked, sinking into Mac's old leather chair in the ranch office. We believe we've found your brother's remains. I need to stress that we're still waiting for positive identification through dental records, but the evidence is very strong. I'm sorry, Ms. Henderson Walsh. I know this isn't the news you were hoping for. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Part of her had always known Mac was dead. It was the only explanation that made sense for why he would never contact his family. But another part of her had clung to the hope that maybe he had amnesia, or was being held somewhere, or had chosen to start a new life for reasons she couldn't understand. "Where?" she finally asked. "Where did you find him?" "In San Antonio, near the Alamo. A metal detector enthusiast discovered the remains earlier today." "San Antonio?" Rebecca was confused. Mac had no reason to be in San Antonio. He'd never even mentioned the city to me. That's one of the things we're hoping to figure out. Detective Chen from Fort Worth is sending us all the files from the original investigation. We're going to reopen this case and find out what happened to your brother. After hanging up the phone, Rebecca sat in Mac's chair for nearly an hour, surrounded by the remnants of his life. His rodeo trophies still lined the shelves, his favorite coffee mug still sat on the desk, and his reading glasses were still folded neatly next to a stack of cattle breeding magazines. She called her parents first, then Tommy Rodriguez. The bye conversations were heartbreaking, a mixture of relief at finally having answers and grief at having their worst fears confirmed. Mac's parents, now in their 80s, took the news with the quiet dignity they had maintained throughout the 15-year ordeal. "At least now we can bring him home," Mac's father said simply. "At least now we can say goodbye properly." Meanwhile, in San Antonio, Detective Gonzalez was working late into the night, reviewing the files that Detective Chen had sent from Fort Worth. The original investigation had been thorough. Hundreds of interviews, extensive searches, financial records, analysis, phone records examination, but reading through it all with fresh eyes and the knowledge of where Mac's body had been found, certain details stood out. The mysterious phone call at 4:30 p.m. was still the key to everything. Someone had lured Mac away from the convention with that call, and that someone had to be his killer. But the prepaid phone had been a dead end, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Dallas, no surveillance footage available, no way to trace the buyer. Detective Gonzalez made a list of everyone who had been interviewed in the original investigation. Tommy Rodriguez, best friend, had been with Mac all day until the phone call. Sarah Martinez, Mac's ex-girlfriend from 2 years prior, had an alibi. Various ranch employees and business associates, convention attendees who remembered seeing Mac hotel staff and security. One name caught her attention: David Kellerman, a horse trader from San Antonio who had done business with Mac's ranch on several occasions. According to the interview notes, Kellerman had been at the Fort Worth convention and had spoken with Mac earlier in the day about a potential horse purchase. San Antonio, the same city where Mac's body had been found. Detective Gonzalez immediately looked up David Kellerman's current address and criminal history. He was still living in San Antonio, running a horse trading business out of a ranch on the outskirts of the city. His record showed a few minor infractions, unpaid taxes, a dispute over a horse sale that had been settled out of court. But nothing violent. Still, it was the first concrete connection between Mac Henderson and San Antonio that had emerged in 15 years of investigation. She decided to pay Mr. Kellerman a visit first thing in the morning. David Kellerman's ranch sat on 20 acres of scrubland about 30 minutes outside San Antonio. As Detective Gonzalez drove up the dusty road leading to the main house, she could see dozens of horses grazing in various paddocks and several large barns that looked like they had seen better days. Kellerman himself was a tall, lean man in his 60s with weathered skin and suspicious eyes. When Detective Gonzalez showed him her badge and explained why she was there, his demeanor immediately became defensive. "Mac Henderson, Jesus, that was 15 years ago. Why are you asking about him now?" "Because we found his body yesterday, Mr. Kellerman, buried here in San Antonio." Kellerman's face went pale, and he sat down heavily on the porch steps of his house. "Dead? Mac's dead? You seem surprised by that news." "Of course I'm surprised. Mac was a good guy, a straight shooter. We did business together for years." "What happened to him?" Detective Gonzalez studied Kellerman's reaction carefully. He seemed genuinely shocked by the news, but 15 years was a long time to practice a response. "That's what we're trying to figure out. I understand you spoke with Mac at the Fort Worth convention on the day he disappeared." "Yeah, We talked about a horse he was interested in buying, a quarter-horse mare I had for sale. Good bloodlines, perfect for his breeding program. Did you arrange to meet with him later that day? No, nothing like that. He said he'd think about it and get back to me. That was the last time I saw him. Detective Gonzalez made notes as they talked. Mr. Kellerman, I need to ask you directly. Did you call Mac Henderson at 4:30 p.m. on July 12, 2003? What? No. Why would I call him? Like I said, he was going to get back to me about the horse. Where were you that evening after the convention? Kellerman thought for a moment. I drove back to San Antonio that night. Got home around 8 or 9 p.m., I think. My wife was still alive then. She could have told you, but she passed away 3 years ago. Did you have any other contact with Mac after that day? None. When he never called me back about the horse, I figured he'd found something better elsewhere. Happens all the time in this business. Detective Gonzalez looked around the property. It was isolated with plenty of space to bury a body without being noticed. But something about Kellerman's responses felt genuine. Either he was an excellent liar, or he truly had nothing to do with Mac's death. Mr. Kellerman, would you be willing to provide a DNA sample for elimination purposes? Sure, whatever you need. I want to help find out what happened to Mac. He was a good man. As Detective Gonzalez drove back to San Antonio, she felt like she was missing something important. The connection between Kellerman and Mac was legitimate, but it didn't feel like the answer to the mystery. There had to be something else, some other reason Mac had ended up in San Antonio. Back at the station, she found a message waiting for her from Dr. Reeves, the medical examiner. The preliminary autopsy results were in, and they contained a shocking revelation. Detective Gonzalez, you need to get down here immediately, Dr. Reeves said when she called back. I've found something that changes everything about this case. 20 minutes later, Detective Gonzalez stood in the sterile autopsy room, looking down at Mac Henderson's remains laid out on the examination table. Dr. Reeves pointed to the skull, where a clear fracture was visible. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head, Dr. Reeves explained. This wasn't an accident or a natural death. Marcus Henderson was murdered. Can you tell what kind of weapon was used? Something heavy and rounded, a rock, maybe a hammer, possibly a baseball bat. The fracture pattern suggests a single, powerful blow. Detective Gonzalez stared at the skull, imagining Mac's final moments. Someone had lured him away from the safety of the crowded convention, brought him to San Antonio, and killed him with a single blow to the head. There's something else, Dr. Reeves continued. I found traces of rope fibers on the wrist bones. He was tied up before he was killed. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Someone had planned Mac's murder, had restrained him, and had chosen the location of his grave carefully. How long between death and burial? Detective Gonzalez asked. Hard to say exactly, but based on the condition of the remains and the way they were positioned, I'd estimate he was buried within 24 to 48 hours of death. Whoever did this didn't keep the body around long. As Detective Gonzalez left the medical examiner's office, her phone rang. It was Detective Chen from Fort Worth. Maria, I've been going through the old files again, and I found something we might have missed the first time around. 3 days before Mac disappeared, he made a large cash withdrawal from his bank account. $5,000. 5,000? What for? That's what we need to find out. The bank records show it was withdrawn in person at a branch in Amarillo. Mac told the teller he needed it for a business transaction. Detective Gonzalez felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift. A mysterious phone call, a large cash withdrawal, a murder in San Antonio. This was beginning to look like Mac had been lured into some kind of business deal that had gone terribly wrong. But who would kill a man for $5,000? And why go to the trouble of transporting his body to San Antonio and burying it near one of Texas's most famous landmarks? The answers were out there, buried as deeply as Mac Henderson had been. But Detective Gonzalez was determined to dig them up no matter how long it took. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after Mac's remains were discovered, Detective Gonzalez received a call from a woman named Linda Vasquez, who worked as a records clerk at a title company in San Antonio. Detective, I saw the news story about that cowboy they found, near the Alamo. The name Marcus Henderson rang a bell, so I went through our old files. We have records of a property transaction from 2003 involving someone with that name. Detective Gonzalez felt her pulse quicken. What kind of property transaction? It was for a ranch property about 40 miles outside San Antonio. The deal fell through at the last minute, but all the preliminary paperwork was filed. Marcus Henderson was listed as the potential buyer. Do you still have those records? Everything's here. The property was 500 acres. Asking price was $850,000. Henderson had put down a $50,000 earnest money deposit and was scheduled to close on July 15, 2003. July 15th, just 3 days after Mac had disappeared from Fort Worth. Detective Gonzalez immediately drove to the title company to examine the records in person. The file painted a picture that completely contradicted everything Mac's family and friends had said about his plans and financial situation. According to the documents, Mac had been in negotiations to purchase the San Antonio ranch for over 2 months. The seller was listed as Elena Morales, a widow whose husband had died the previous year. But the most shocking discovery was in the financing documents. Mac hadn't been planning to use a traditional mortgage. Instead, he had arranged to pay cash for the entire property, $850,000 in cash. Detective Gonzalez immediately called Rebecca Henderson Walsh. Rebecca, I need to ask you about your brother's finances. Did Mac ever mention wanting to buy property in San Antonio? San Antonio? No, never. Mac was completely focused on expanding our family ranch here in Amarillo. He would never have considered buying property anywhere else. What about his financial situation? Would he have had access to $850,000 in cash? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Detective, our ranch was successful, but we weren't millionaires. Mac might have had $100,000 in savings at most. There's no way he could have come up with that kind of money legitimately. The implications were staggering. If Mac had been planning to pay cash for an $850,000 ranch, where was that money coming from? And why had he kept it secret from his family? Detective Gonzalez's next call was to Elena Morales, the woman who had been selling the ranch. She was now 78 years old and living in a retirement community in San Antonio. Mrs. Morales, I'm investigating the death of Marcus Henderson. I understand you were selling him a ranch in 2003? Elena's voice was shaky but clear. Oh yes, I remember. Marcus. Such a nice young man. I was so disappointed when the sale fell through. I really needed the money after my husband died. Can you tell me about your interactions with Mr. Henderson? He came to look at the property several times. Always very professional, very knowledgeable about ranching. He said he was planning to start a new operation, something about breeding horses for rodeo competitions. Did he ever mention where he was getting the money for the purchase? He said he had been saving for years and had recently come into some additional funds through a business partnership. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my business as long as the money was good. Mrs. Morales, do you remember anything unusual about Mr. Henderson's behavior during your last meeting? Elena thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, he did seem nervous during our final meeting. It was on July 11th, the day before he was supposed to bring the rest of the money. He kept checking his phone and seemed distracted. He asked me several times if I was sure I wanted to sell, if I had told anyone else about our deal. Did he say why he was concerned about that? He said he had some business competitors who might try to interfere with the purchase if they found out about it. I thought it was strange. What kind of competitors would care about a ranch sale? Detective Gonzalez thanked Elena and hung up, her mind racing. Mac had been involved in some kind of business deal that required secrecy and had generated enough money for him to buy an $850,000 ranch in cash. But what kind of business generated that much money and required such secrecy? The answer came when she cross-referenced Mac's phone records with the timeline of the ranch purchase. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Mac had made dozens of calls to a number registered to a company called Lone Star Livestock Transport, based in Houston. A quick search revealed that Lone Star Livestock Transport had been shut down by federal authorities in 2004 for involvement in a cattle rustling operation that had stolen over $2 million worth of livestock across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. The pieces were finally falling into place. Mac Henderson hadn't been the innocent victim everyone believed him to be. He had been involved in cattle rustling, and the money for the San Antonio ranch had come from selling stolen livestock. But if Mac was part of the rustling operation, who had killed him, and why? Detective Gonzalez called the FBI field office in Houston and was connected to Agent Patricia Williams, who had led the investigation into Lone Star Livestock Transport. Agent Williams, I'm investigating a murder that may be connected to your cattle rustling case from 2003-2004. The victim is Marcus Henderson. Henderson, that name is familiar. Let me pull up the file. There was a pause as Agent Williams accessed her computer. Here it is. Marcus Henderson was one of our primary suspects, but he disappeared before we could bring him in for questioning. We always assumed he had fled the country. He didn't flee. Someone killed him and buried his body in San Antonio. That's a significant development. Henderson was supposed to be our key witness. We had evidence that he was planning to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for immunity. Detective Gonzalez felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. He was going to turn state's evidence? According to our informant, yes. Henderson had gotten cold feet about the operation and wanted out. He was planning to provide us with names, locations, financial records, everything we needed to shut down the entire network. Who else was involved in the operation? The ringleader was a man named Carlos Mendoza, but he was just the organizer. The operation involved dozens of people across multiple states, ranchers, truck drivers, livestock dealers, even some people in law enforcement who looked the other way. Is Mendoza still alive? He died in federal prison in 2010. But detective, if Henderson was killed to prevent him from talking to us, that means someone in the organization found out about his plan to cooperate. Someone who had a lot to lose if the truth came out. Detective Gonzalez requested copies of all the FBI files related to the cattle rustling investigation. As she waited for the documents to arrive, she couldn't help but think about Rebecca Henderson Walsh and Mac's parents. They had spent 15 years believing their son and brother was an innocent victim. Learning that he had been involved in criminal activity would be devastating, but it would also finally provide answers to the questions that had haunted them for so long. The FBI files arrived the next morning, and Detective Gonzalez spent hours poring over the details of the cattle rustling operation. The scope was staggering. Over 200 head of cattle stolen from ranches across the Southwest, with a sophisticated network of fake documentation, bribed inspectors, and legitimate-seeming livestock dealers who served as fronts for the operation. Mac Henderson's role had been crucial. As a respected rancher with an impeccable reputation, he had provided legitimacy to the operation. Stolen cattle would be temporarily housed at his ranch, where they would be rebranded and given false documentation before being sold at livestock auctions across Texas. But according to the FBI files, Mac had become increasingly uncomfortable with the operation as it grew larger and more violent. Several ranchers who had gotten too close to discovering the truth had been threatened, and one had been hospitalized after a riding accident that investigators suspected was actually an assault. The final straw had come when Carlos Mendoza had ordered the theft of 50 head of cattle from a small family ranch in New Mexico. The theft had bankrupted the family and forced them to sell their land to developers. Mac had apparently been horrified by the human cost of their crimes and had reached out to the FBI through an intermediary. Detective Gonzalez found the name of the FBI informant who had been Mac's contact, a livestock dealer named Robert Bobby Crane, who had been caught selling stolen cattle and had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Bobby Crane was still alive and living in Austin, working as a mechanic after serving 3 years in federal prison. When Detective Gonzalez called him, he immediately agreed to meet with her. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask me about Mac Henderson," Bobby said when they met at a diner in Austin. He was a small, nervous man in his 60s with calloused hands and tired eyes. "I always knew something bad had happened to him. Tell me about Mac's decision to cooperate with the FBI." Mac was a good man who got in over his head. At first, the operation seemed harmless, just moving some cattle around, making some extra money. But Mendoza kept pushing for bigger, and Bigger jobs, and things started getting violent. What was the final straw for Mac? The Ramirez family in New Mexico. They were small-time ranchers just trying to make a living. When Mendoza's crew stole their cattle, it destroyed them. Mac saw the newspaper article about them losing their ranch, and he called me that night crying. Said he couldn't live with what they were doing anymore. So he agreed to work with the FBI? More than that. Mac had kept detailed records of everything. Dates, locations, names, financial transactions. He was going to hand over enough evidence to put the entire operation out of business. Who else knew about Mac's plan to cooperate? Bobby's face darkened. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Mac was supposed to meet with Agent Williams on July 16, 2003, but somehow word got out that he was planning to talk. How do you think the information leaked? There were only a few people who knew about Mac's decision. Me, Agent Williams, Mac himself, and... Bobby paused, looking uncomfortable. And who? Mac's business partner in the operation. A guy named Vincent Torres. Mac trusted him completely. They'd been friends since high school. Mac thought he could convince Vincent to cooperate too. Detective Gonzalez felt her heart rate increase. Vincent Torres? Was he from the Fort Worth area? Yeah, he had a small ranch outside Fort Worth. Nothing fancy, but it was perfect for their operation because it was close to several major livestock auctions. Do you know if Torres is still alive? Last I heard, he was. After the FBI investigation ended, he managed to avoid prosecution because Mac never got the chance to testify against him. Without Mac's testimony and records, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Detective Gonzalez immediately ran a background check on Vincent Torres. He was 58 years old, still living on a ranch outside Fort Worth, and had no criminal record. But more importantly, his phone records from July 2003 showed that he had made several calls to Mac's cell phone in the days leading up to the disappearance, including one at 4:15 p.m. on July 12th, just 15 minutes before the mysterious call that had lured Mac away from the convention. The timeline was becoming clear. Vincent Torres had learned about Mac's plan to cooperate with the FBI, possibly from Mac himself. Torres had then lured Mac to San Antonio under some pretext, perhaps claiming he wanted to see the ranch Mac was planning to buy, or suggesting they needed to meet to discuss their next move. Instead, Torres had killed his childhood friend to protect himself from prosecution. Detective Gonzalez immediately contacted Detective Chen in Fort Worth to request assistance in bringing Torres in for questioning. But when Fort Worth police arrived at Torres's ranch, they found it abandoned. According to neighbors, Torres had left 3 days earlier, claiming he was going to visit relatives in Mexico. A bolo alert was issued for Vincent Torres, but Detective Gonzalez suspected he was already across the border. After 15 years of freedom, the discovery of Mac's body had finally spooked him into running. But running wouldn't save him. Detective Gonzalez was determined to bring Mac Henderson's killer to justice, no matter how long it took or how far Torres had fled. The manhunt for Vincent Torres lasted 6 weeks. Despite his head start, Torres had made a crucial mistake. He had used his real name when crossing into Mexico at Laredo, apparently believing that the 15-year-old case would never catch up with him. Mexican authorities, working with the FBI and U.S. Marshals, tracked Torres to a small town outside Guadalajara, where he had been staying with distant relatives. When they arrested him at a local cantina, he was using a fake identity but still carried his real driver's license in his wallet. Detective Gonzalez flew to Mexico to escort Torres back to Texas. During the long flight, she studied the man who had killed Mac Henderson. Torres was a small, unremarkable-looking man with graying hair and nervous eyes. He looked more like a retired accountant than a murderer. "Mr. Torres," she said as they flew over the Gulf of Mexico, "we have enough evidence to convict you of Mac Henderson's murder. Your phone records, your connection to the cattle rustling operation, your flight to Mexico, it all points to you. This is your chance to tell your side of the story." Torres stared out the airplane window for a long time before speaking. "Mac was my best friend," he said quietly. "We grew up together, went to the same schools, were each other's best men at our weddings. I never wanted to hurt him. But you did hurt him, you killed him. I didn't have a choice." Torres's voice cracked with emotion. Mac was going to destroy everything. He was going to send me to prison for the rest of my life. So you decided to kill him instead? Torres was quiet again for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I called him that day at the convention. Told him I wanted to see the ranch he was buying in San Antonio, that maybe we could work together on a legitimate operation down there. Mac was so excited. He thought I was finally ready to go straight like he was. What happened when you met him in San Antonio? We drove out to the ranch together. Mac was talking about his plans, how he was going to breed quarter horses, how we could be partners in something legal for once. He was so happy, so hopeful about the future. Detective Gonzalez waited for Torres to continue. When we got to the ranch, I told him I knew about his plan to cooperate with the FBI. Mac didn't deny it. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't live with what we'd done anymore. He begged me to come with him, to tell the truth and start over. But you refused. I couldn't go to prison. I had a wife, kids in college, grandchildren on the way. My whole life would have been over. So you killed your best friend to protect yourself. Torres began to cry. I hit him with a tire iron from my truck. I didn't plan it. I just got so angry, so scared. One minute we were talking and the next minute Mac was on the ground bleeding. What did you do with his body? I panicked. I put him in the back of my truck and drove around for hours trying to figure out what to do. Finally, I remembered reading about how the Alamo was built on top of old burial grounds, how they were always finding bones during construction projects. I thought if I buried him there, people would just assume it was an old grave if they ever found him. You tied him up before you buried him? Torres looked surprised. How did you... Mac wasn't dead when I hit him. He was unconscious, but he was still breathing. I tied him up because I was afraid he would wake up and try to escape. But by the time I finished digging the grave, he had stopped breathing. I swear I didn't mean to kill him. Detective Gonzalez felt sick. Mac Henderson had been buried alive by his best friend, left to suffocate in a shallow grave near one of Texas's most sacred landmarks. What about the money Mac was going to use to buy the ranch? He had it with him in a duffel bag, $850,000, in cash. It was his share of the profits from the cattle operation, plus money he'd been saving for years. I took it and buried it on my ranch. I was too scared to spend it. Is it still there? Yes. I never touched a penny of it. Every time I looked at that money, I saw Mac's face. When they landed in San Antonio, Torres was formally charged with the murder of Marcus Henderson. The case made national headlines, a 15-year-old cold case solved by a metal detector enthusiast and dogged police work. But for Detective Gonzalez, the most important moment came when she called Rebecca Henderson Walsh to tell her that her brother's killer had been caught. He confessed, she told Rebecca. Vincent Torres has admitted to killing Mac. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Vincent Torres, I remember him. He came to Mac's funeral. He hugged me and told me how sorry he was for our loss. He helped carry Mac's empty coffin. The cruelty of that image, Mac's killer serving as a pallbearer at his own victim's funeral, was almost too much to bear. Rebecca, there's something else you need to know. Mac was involved in cattle rustling, but he was trying to get out. He was going to cooperate with the FBI to shut down the operation. In the end, he was trying to do the right thing. That sounds like Mac, Rebecca said through her tears. He always tried to fix his mistakes no matter what it cost him. 3 months later, Vincent Torres pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The $850,000 he had buried on his ranch was recovered and returned to the families whose cattle had been stolen, including the Ramirez family in New Mexico, who had lost their ranch 15 years earlier. Mac Henderson's remains were finally laid to rest in the family cemetery on the ranch in Amarillo, with full military honors for his service in the National Guard. Hundreds of people attended the funeral, including many who had never given up, hope that Mac would someday come home. Tommy Rodriguez delivered the eulogy, speaking about his best friend's love of horses, his dedication to his family, and his ultimate decision to choose what was right over what was easy. Mac made some mistakes, Tommy said, looking out over the crowd of mourners. But in the end, he was willing to sacrifice everything to make things right. That's the Mac Henderson I want to remember. Not the man who got caught up in something bad, but the man who found the courage to walk away from it. As the sun set over the Texas plains, Mac Henderson was finally at peace. His killer had been brought to justice, his family had answers to their questions, and his story had become a reminder that it's never too late to choose the right path, even when that choice comes with the ultimate price. The cowboy had finally come home. 6 months after Vincent Torres's conviction, Detective Maria Gonzalez received an unexpected visitor at the San Antonio Police Department. Frank Morrison, the metal detector enthusiast who had discovered Mac Henderson's remains, walked into her office carrying a small wooden box. "Detective, I wanted to give you this," Frank said, setting the box on her desk. "I made it from wood salvaged from the old oak tree near where I found Mac's body. The city had to cut it down during the restoration work at the Alamo, and I thought Mac's family might want something to remember him by." Inside the box was a simple brass plaque that read, "In memory of Marcus Mac Henderson, a man who chose to do what was right." Detective Gonzalez was touched by the gesture. Over the months since the case had closed, she had stayed in contact with the Henderson family, watching as they slowly healed from 15 years of uncertainty and grief. Rebecca Henderson Walsh had used the media attention from the case to establish the Marcus Henderson Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the complex process of searching for their loved ones. The foundation provided resources, support groups, and advocacy services to families who found themselves in the same desperate situation the Hendersons had faced. Mac always wanted to help people, Rebecca had told Detective Gonzalez during the foundation's launch event. "This feels like the right way to honor his memory and turn something terrible into something that can help others." The foundation had already assisted dozens of families across Texas, providing them with the kind of support and resources that the Henderson family had desperately needed during their darkest hours. Rebecca had become a powerful advocate for missing persons cases, testifying before the state legislature about the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and more resources for cold case investigations. Mac's parents, now in their 80s, had found a different kind of peace. His father had returned to the family ranch with renewed purpose, establishing a scholarship fund for young people interested in pursuing careers in law enforcement or criminal justice. His mother had begun volunteering at a local victims advocacy center, using her own experience to help other families cope with loss and uncertainty. "Knowing the truth doesn't bring Mac back," his mother had said during a recent interview with a local television station. "But it does give us the ability to move forward. For 15 years we were stuck in that moment when Mac disappeared. Now we can finally grieve properly and celebrate the good man he was." The case had also had a profound impact on the law enforcement community. The successful resolution of such an old cold case had led to increased funding for cold case units across Texas, and Detective Gonzalez had been promoted to head a new regional task force dedicated to solving missing persons cases. "The Henderson case showed us that no case is ever truly cold," she explained to a conference of detectives and FBI agents. "Sometimes it just takes the right piece of evidence, the right witness, or the right investigator to bring the truth to light." The task force had already reopened dozens of old missing persons cases, using new technology and investigative techniques to re-examine evidence that had been collected years or even decades earlier. 3 additional cases had been solved in the 6 months since the task force was established, bringing closure to families who had given up hope of ever learning the truth. 1 year after Mac Henderson's body was finally laid to rest, the annual Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo held a special ceremony in his memory. A bronze plaque was installed near the entrance to the convention center, commemorating Mac's life and serving as a reminder that behind every missing person case is a family searching for answers. Tommy Rodriguez, now retired from professional rodeo but still working as a horse trainer, spoke at the ceremony. "Mac loved this place," he said, gesturing toward the bustling convention center. "He loved the horses, the competition, the community of people who shared his passion. It's fitting that he's remembered here, in the place where he was last seen alive." The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had known Mac personally, and others who had been touched by his story. Rebecca Henderson Walsh was there with her children, who had grown up hearing stories about their Uncle Mac but had never had the chance to meet him. "I want my kids to know that their uncle was a good man who made some bad choices but ultimately tried to do the right thing," Rebecca said. "That's a lesson we can all learn from." Vincent Torres, meanwhile, was serving his life sentence at a maximum security prison in East Texas. According to prison officials, he had become a model prisoner, spending his time reading, writing letters to Mac's family asking for forgiveness, and participating in a victim impact program designed to help inmates understand the consequences of their actions. "Torres will never be released from prison," Detective Gonzalez explained to a group of criminal justice students during a guest lecture at the University of Texas. But his cooperation in solving the case and his genuine remorse have provided some measure of closure for the Henderson family. Sometimes that's the best outcome we can hope for in cases like this. The cattle rustling operation that had ultimately led to Mac's death had been completely dismantled, with dozens of participants serving prison sentences or paying substantial fines. The investigation had recovered over $3 million in stolen livestock and equipment, much of which was returned to the ranchers who had been victimized by the operation. The Ramirez family in New Mexico, whose financial ruin had been the catalyst for Mac's decision to cooperate with authorities, used their share of the recovered money to buy back their family ranch. They had invited the Henderson family to visit, and Rebecca had accepted, saying she wanted to see the place that had meant so much to her brother in his final days. "Mac died trying to help people he had never met," she said. "The least we can do is honor that by getting to know the people he was trying to help." As the sun set over Fort Worth on the anniversary of Mac's disappearance, Detective Gonzalez stood in the parking lot where Mac Henderson had last been seen alive. The convention center was busy with another livestock show, filled with cowboys and ranchers pursuing their dreams just as Mac had done 20 years earlier. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A metal detector enthusiast's curiosity, a family's refusal to give up hope, and the dedication of law enforcement officers who believed that every victim deserved justice. No matter how much time had passed, Mac Henderson's story had become more than just a solved murder case. It had become a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of doing what's right even when it's difficult, and the healing that can come from finally learning the truth. The cowboy's last ride was over, but his legacy would continue, to inspire others for years to come. Note: this story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.